Information security is a domain 3, which means it's one of the most important domains within the CISSP CBK. This contains the information security governance and risk management domain. IC² defines the content as follows. Information security governance and risk management domain entails the identification of an organization's information assets and the development, documentation, implementation, and updating of policies, standards, procedures, and guidelines that ensure their confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Management tools such as data classification, risk assessment, and risk analysis are used to identify threats, classify assets, and to rate their vulnerabilities so that the effective security measures and controls can be implemented. The candidate is expected to understand the planning, the organization, roles, and responsibilities of individuals in identifying and securing the organization's information assets. The development and use of policies stating management's views and position on particular topics and the use of guidelines, standards, and procedures to support the policies. Security training to make the employees aware of the importance of information security, its significance, and the specific security-related requirements relative to their position. The importance of confidentiality, proprietary and private information, third-party management, and service-level agreements related to information security. Employment agreements, employee hiring and termination practices, and risk management practices, and tools to identify, rate, and reduce the risk to specific resources. First and foremost, we must realize we have to align our security with our goals, our missions, and objective of the organizations. Once an organization has got these, specifically in a security department, you have to align business and security at the same time. We have to understand and apply security governance. And if we look a little bit deeper, we realize that information security governance, or ISG, is a subset discipline of the corporate governance focused on information security and their performance and risk management. The organization processes such as acquisitions, in the case of mergers and acquisitions, and then also governance committees is important when we look at information security governance. There are definitely some different frameworks. However, often it is an eclectic solution, which means that we can take numerous frameworks and select the best and create our own, but focusing on one as a primary and then align to some of the other frameworks to ensure that corporate governance is maintained. Now, this is a very good slide just looking at the security policy statement in the security office. Now, this is utopia, whereby, as you can see, I've got my information security management system, contingency planning, and DRP is alongside with that. My information security officer is reporting into that management system. And although you can actually look at all the other components, our forum that feeds back into it via our security management, we have multiple users looking at security management. This area from an information security officer should report back into, if you can, into a financial environment instead of my CIO. The reason why it is stated is that it is a segregation of duty. It is not wrong that the CIO has the overseeing element to the chief security officer. However, it is found often that it is more of a expectation management process and hiding some of the weaknesses in organizations. Now, there are definitely some security roles and responsibilities throughout the organization. First and foremost, the board. And the board is a rudder that actually steers this huge ship. They make decisions, and based on committees reporting to them, make informed decisions. We have internal audit, which is, to me, like a police function in your organization. Some auditors don't like that word, but they will make sure that the policies are adhered to. External audited. If you are audited from an external point of view, this is sometimes a legal requirement and also a governance requirement, and they will make sure that the shareholders' interests are at heart in the organization. We have information security. We could have a chief security officer. We have information security analysts specialized in certain areas. Help desk is high risk in an organization due to the fact that they have access to passwords and some confidential information, which normally should not be the case. External consultants, also high risk from a security point of view, purely because that sometimes they don't go through the rigorous checks that you do for staff. Line management is our ammunition at the end of the day to make sure that our policies are enforced and we have buy-in. And then end users needs to be managed so that the awareness is high and also morale is high. And as soon as the awareness is done properly, our incidents will increase initially and then lower at a later stage. Now, when we look at legislative and regulatory compliance, it says that legislative compliance is normally referred to the steps that are taken and complied with. Regulatory compliance describes the goal that corporations or public agencies aspire to in their efforts to ensure that personnel are aware of and take steps to comply with relevant laws and regulations. There's a privacy requirement compliance. Privacy concerns exist wherever personally identifiable information is collected and stored in digital form or otherwise. Improper or non-existent disclosure controls can be the root cause for privacy issues. Data privacy issues can arise in response to information from a wide range of sources such as healthcare records, criminal justice, investigations and proceedings, financial institutions and transactions, biological traits such as genetic material, residence and geographic records, ethnicity, and privacy breach. When you look at this, you need to consider acts such as the Data Protection Act, which is an EU directive, also the American Harbor Law. The Safe Harbor Program and passenger name record issues, such as in the United States Department of Commerce, created the International Safe Harbor Privacy Principles certification in response to the 1995 Directive on Data Protection. This is part of the directive of the European Commission. This directive declares in Chapter 4 that personal data may only be transferred from the countries in the European Economic Area to countries which provide adequate privacy protection. In the case where you want to transport it to other countries that does not fall under this requirement, you need to have a special ombudsman and clearance to send this data out. Now, when we look at privacy information, certain standards have been defined and languages and standards have been done so that we can actually communicate between different systems and ensure that we all speak the same language pertaining to privacy information. P3P is a standard for communicating privacy practices and comparing them to preferences of individuals. XACML, which is the Extensible Access Control Markup Language, together with its privacy profile, is a standard for expressing privacy policies in a machine-readable language, which software system can use to enforce the policy in enterprise IT systems. We have EPAL, which is the Enterprise Privacy Authorization Language, similar to XACML, but it's not a standard. There's WS Privacy and also other communication methods such as specification for communicating in privacy policy, for example, in web services. That could be SOAP as an example. Then we have control frameworks. A control framework is a data structure that organizes and categorizes an organization's internal controls, which are practices and procedures established to create business values and minimize risk. Numerous models with the same goal. We have COSO, COCO, Basel, COVID, and ISO, each focusing in a different area. If you look at COSO, which is the Committee for Sponsoring Organizations, which defines that COSO's internal control is an integrated framework which was introduced in 1992 as a guidance on how to establish better control so companies can achieve their objectives with minimal surprises. COSO categories entity-level objectives into operations, financial reporting, and compliance. The framework includes more than 20 basic principles representing the fundamental concepts associated with its 5 components. We have the control environment, we have risk assessment on that environment, control activities, information and communication, and finally monitoring. Some of the principles include key elements for compliance such as integrity and ethical values, authorities and responsibilities, policies, procedures, and finally reporting deficiencies. COCA, which is the Criteria of Control Framework, also developed or introduced in 1992 with the objective of improving organizational performance and decision-making with better controls, risk management, and corporate governance. Also in 1995, the Guidance on Control was produced and described in the COCA framework and defining controls. The framework includes 20 criteria for effective control in 4 areas of the organization. We have purpose, which is direction. We have commitment, identity and values. We have capability, which is competence, and monitoring and learning, part of the evolution. Now, Basel 2.3, the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision, which includes supervisory authorities from Belgium, Canada, France, and many other countries, introduced the framework for internal control systems in 1998. Regulatory compliance is an integral part of the framework. The 5 elements of internal control are management oversight and control culture, risk recognition and assessment, control activities and segregation of duties, information and communication and monitoring activities, and corrective deficiencies. The effective functioning of these 5 elements is key to an organization's achieving its performance, information, and compliance objective. This was developed to ensure that the financial risk of organizations are met adequately. We also have COBIT, which is the control objectives for the information and related to technology. Now, COBIT 5 is based on 5 principles. Principle 1 is the meeting stakeholders' needs. Principle 2 is covering the enterprise end-to-end. Principle 3 is applying a single integrated framework. Principle 4 is enabling a holistic approach. Principle 5 is separating governance from management. There's also 7 enablers within COBIT. We have the principles, policies, and frameworks as enabler 1, which are the vehicle to translate the desired behavior into practical guidance for day-to-day management. Principle 2, the enabler 2 is the processes described in an organized set of practices and activities to achieve certain objectives and produce a set of outputs in support of achieving overall IT-related goals. Enabler 3 is organizational structures, which are key decision-making entities in an enterprise. Enabler 4, the culture, ethics, and behavior of individuals and of the enterprise are very often underestimated, such as success factors in governance and management activities. Enabler 5 is the information that is required for keeping the organizations running and well governed. But at the operational level, information is very often the key of the product of the enterprise itself. Enabler 6 is services, infrastructure, and applications include the infrastructure, technology, and applications that provide the enterprise with information technology, processing, and services. The final enabler 7 is people, skills, and competencies that are required for successful completion of all activities and for making correct decisions and taking corrective actions. The ISO 27000 series focuses on information security management system. The 27000 series help organizations establish information security standards that meet business needs while ensuring compliance with regulatory and contractual requirements. Other specific control frameworks include ITIL, which is the Information Technology Infrastructure Library, sitting in version 3 at the moment. FIRM, which is the Fundamental Information Risk Management from the ISF, the Information Security Forum. The ISO 27000, the whole series. We have MOF, which is the Microsoft Operations Framework and implementation of ITIL. We have the Cisco SCF. Although this course is not product specific, it is important to mention that some vendors bring security control frameworks to the fore, and this is the Cisco Security Control Framework. The payment card industry, or the PCI DSS. And governance frameworks. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 was developed due to the fate of some organizations from a corporate director point of view. So SOX, the USA, we have King reports in South Africa, and then also adaptation of SOX in other countries. As you can see, Bill 9198 from Canada, India, Turkey, TC SOX 11. Now, you don't need to know the others from a SOX point of view, but understand that SOX is an act that was developed. And when they talk about SOX, Section 404 defines in SOX that we have to ensure that the reporting for financial systems is trusted. And that's basically the focus point, and sometimes also the sections which define that the communication has to be logged. Due care means that policies and implemented actions that an organization has taken to minimize risk to its tangible and intangible assets, that is, information assets, customers, employees, resources, and of course, reputation. Due diligence means that the continual actions that an organization are doing to protect and minimize risk to its tangible and intangible assets. If we take this example and we try to define the differences in real life scenario, I usually use information security protection from an antivirus point of view. If I buy antivirus software, it means I've done my due care. However, installing it and making sure it's implemented and updated regularly and taking action on that, that is due diligence. When we look at confidentiality, integrity, and availability, we all know what that basically means, but let's quickly go through that. We have some principles. We have the security objective triad, such as confidentiality, which means the preserving of authorized restriction on information, access, and disclosure, including means for protecting personal privacy and proprietary information. Integrity is the guarding against improper information modification or destruction and includes ensuring information non-repudiation and authenticity. Availability means that ensuring timely and reliable access and use of information. In contrast to the threats of confidentiality, which is disclosure, integrity, which is unauthorized modification, and availability, which is destruction. Need to know means that users should only have access to information or systems that enable them to perform their assigned job functions. Least privilege means that users should only have sufficient access privileges that allow them to perform their assigned work. Separation of duties means that no person should be responsible for completing a task involving sensitive, valuable, or critical information from the beginning to the end. No single person should be responsible for approving his or her own work. When you look at policies, procedures, standards, and baselines, when we develop policy, we need organizational policy input. So there's critical documentation such as law, regulations, business requirements, my company's and security department's missions, goals, and objectives. And policies are required in frameworks such as COBIT, CMM, and ISO 27000. Policies are important because they measure criteria. They avoid liability. If I say to a user and he signs a policy that he should not install unauthorized software, if we do fail an audit on unauthorized software infringing on copyright, the liability is moved to the user who has installed it after he signed it. Implementation of security controls, we do see a consistent and adequate security. It definitely demonstrates management support and can also coordinate external and internal parties. Legal requirements may be seen. There's also corporate governance that enforces a requirement for policies. Information classification can only be done adequately if we do have adequate policies on information classification. It does encourage dynamic communication because all parties know what we talk about and we've got the same voice. Procurement is important because most of our fraud takes place at a procurement level, and also application development. In application development, some organizations may say, listen, you are allowed to develop as long as you use certain languages, for example, C or C++, Java. And this ensures that the continuity and the support is adequate. The key development reference material is the first step we have to do for our policy development process. We have to define a framework, how we're going to do this. Coverage matrix means who's applicable to these policies. It's important to understand my target audience. When we develop policies, the critical systems definitions and decisions is important because that will enforce me to focus on the right policies. And during the process flow, I'll develop a policy. It will be reviewed by a committee, for example. It will be approved by everybody that it actually covers, and then it will be enforced. And then regularly we have an anniversary where the review process will be done again and it has to go through the approval process and enforcement again, so it will form that cycle. Now, policies should define an acceptable and appropriate behavior. It does define a foundation of tools and procedures that are required. It communicates a consensus between all users. It is a foundation for HR action during non-compliance, and it also will assist in during the litigation process. Now, when we look at policies, there's trust models. We can trust everyone all of the time, and it's easiest to implement and enforce, in quotes. Your strongest, your weakest link. And then what happens at later stage when something goes wrong? You have a failure of trust. So we can trust no one, most restrictive, and it's not practical. And then we have to strike a balance between trust some people some of the time, and then we can actually go through the process of need to have access, detective controls that are required, and I often say trust but verify. Now, the lack of trust drives a policy development. An assignment of trust needs to be balanced, and what I've seen is that policy infringement leads to policy refinement. And then at the end of the day, we need to say trust no one, as this is part of corporate governance. So trust and verify. The players that should be involved in the policy development process is definitely the users, because they will be part of the scope. Technical users and administrators, they have to review the policies for adequate implementation criteria. This means if your acceptable use policy says that no hacking tools are allowed on the desktop, you may have to define an exceptions, as administrators may have tools that are like hacking tools that is required in line of their that job function. Management, external customers sometimes, if they are applicable, business partners, and also company lawyers and auditors. The company lawyers and auditors are critical because they will review a policy to make sure that there are no contradiction to any other policies in the organization, and also lawyers from the point of there's no contradiction in any legal or actual law of the country. Now, how are we going to develop a policy? We're going to select a policy development team. We're going to create a committee to interpret those policies. We're going to determine the scope and goals of this policy, who is covered, determine the level of detail, which means although we have detail, we never name people in the policy, because those people may leave an organization, then the policy has to be changed. And inside a policy is attributes that normally does not change, due to the fact that if any attribute change in a policy, we need to ratify that whole policy again, give it a consultation period, meaning that we have to publish it in the organization and give the users a window of opportunity to give feedback. Once the users are happy with it, we can implement it. The next step is our target audience, which will be affected, should be review and comment. If they don't review and comment and they are employed at that point in time, the problem is that you may experience that the users may say, I never saw that, so I'm not applicable, it's not sub judice me. Support staff affected should review this. An awareness program should be part of the introduction process, so users are aware of all the policies, and then policy training material at least annually. Some of the organization I've seen that does actually a really good job. What they do is they will actually every 90 days email the acceptable use policy to everybody. Not that you have to sign it again, but it's just part of the awareness process that say, listen, it is sent out there. And as you know, within South Africa, according to the ECT Act, once you send something, the user has read it. Policies must be implementable and enforceable, concise and easy to understand, balance protection with productivity, and it also should state reasons why policies are needed, describe what is covered by the policies, define any contacts and responsibilities in the sense of a administrational management function, define the results of non-compliance. This is an important section. You have to define the result for non-compliance. A policy is a corporate security requirement. However, culture do play a huge role. We need to balance productivity, because if we don't balance it and it is too restrictive, people will look for loopholes. Technical controls in an environment is effective, but not always possible. And management commitment is crucial. Now, when we look at policy development, it often states that the company size and goal is an input to the policy structure. We can have one larger document or several small ones. When the company is huge and large, large. Several small ones are easier to update and maintain. However, you need to make sure that the smaller ones don't conflict. We can have generic and specific policies. Generic being, for example, an acceptable use policy, and specific for remote access. And key policies are a must. I'll go through some of them. We can have the acceptable use, access to information policy, and electronic communication, which may cover things like email usage, internet access, and instant messaging. Information classification policy is very good to have, and also a password policy. Policies provides management with goals and objectives, and I always saw it as a statement of intent. It documents compliance of an organization, and security culture cultivation is an important process here. It indicates a company's maturity level, addresses conflict of future negotiation, and also creates a security or compliance function. Now, when we look at policies, there's supporting elements such as the standards. I call it the what. That is something I can measure. The procedures, the step-by-step, or the how, which is really important also for business continuity and recovery, and also disaster recovery planning. We have the baseline, which is a minimum acceptable level of security, and guidelines, which is a nice to have. Now look at this slide. What I've done here is define a framework for development. Left-hand side, you can see the attributes, what is required in an organization. I have columns B, C, D, and E, some standard requirements on these attributes, and then from a company, what we're going to develop and which references. F, G, and H is my policy, standards, and procedure references in documentations that I've created. Now, if we look at the information lifecycle in an organization, there's a standard that defines, it says the information lifecycle management comprises the policies, the processes, the practices, and tools used to align the business value of information with the most appropriate and cost-effective IT infrastructure from the time information is conceived through its final disposition. Information is aligned with business processes through a management policies and service levels associated with applications, metadata, information, and data. If you look at this, information lifecycle management process is a cycle where we can do the planning at step 1. Information security classification can happen during the planning step, which is 1. We can have step 2 as a collection, the creation, the receipt, and capture of that data. Then step 3 is the organization of that data. 4, use and dissemination. Step 5, maintenance, protection, and preservation. I have step 6, a disposition, which means we get rid of the data. And step 7 will be my assurance to make sure that I have done adequately steps to dispose of that data. That's my evaluation. And then going back to step 1. When we look at the risk management concept, there is a reference on your pack, which is NIST documentation 800-30, which is Risk Management Guide for Information Technology Systems, which defines that risk is the function of the likelihood of a given threat source exercising a particular potential vulnerability and the resulting impact of that adverse event on the organization. Now, if you look at this, we have, for example, owners that have values to assets, but owners who also wish to minimize our risk to my asset, which then the owner will impose countermeasures that may reduce those risks to assets, and the owners may impose countermeasures that may possess vulnerabilities itself, leading to additional risks. So as you see here, this is quite a huge step process to make sure that we do risk management adequately. Now we have an asset, which means that it has a value to the organization. Also understand that an asset will have different values at different times of its life cycle. We have a threat onto that asset. We have a threat agent that enables that threat to occur. We have a certain exposure on the asset, and then also the threat has a probability to be exercised, where in statistical terms 100% probability equals n, where n is 1. We have a vulnerability that is either inherent to the system or not. We have an attack that can take place, and also countermeasures or mitigation that can be applied to reduce our risk. When we look at risk, inherent risk comes with a system, and if we apply any countermeasures or mitigating controls, we have a residual or resultant risk. Now, look at this slide. We have a sweet spot. We have risk high to low, but from the high to the low, we can actually spend some money to make sure that we mitigate that risk. This is my sweet spot whereby it says I should not spend any more money than from that actual sweet spot, as if I spend more money, I actually spend more money than what my risk exposure is equal to. So I'm actually wasting money here. Now, the objectives of risk management includes that we have to identify a threat before it occurs. We have to remove or lessen the impact of that occurrence, and it should be during a system's development life cycle. Often we find from a security point of view, we invite it right at the end of a SDLC. It has to assist in the planning process and also can have input to standard audit programs. Now, risk management means that the residual risk must be at an acceptable level, and it is determined by the custodian of that system or data. Risk management reduces total risk. We need to consider then a threat, the vulnerability, and that asset which determines the impact. Mitigation controls lessen my inherent risk, and risks cannot be totally removed. When we do a risk analysis, we need input of a complete asset register. Now, this is a problem because a complete asset register is a system in flux and very difficult to determine. It can consider the current security stance of the organization, and at the end of the day, it will justify risk mitigation processes and efforts. We need to consider the company's mission statement, goals, and objectives, which will guide us to a risk analysis process. From a bank where my commodity is money, to a shop on the corner where the commodity might be fruit and vegetables, it's a different process of looking at our objectives and goals in the organization. The benefits of a risk analysis is good corporate and IT governance, focus, effort, and resources, and it will have input to policy development, input to BCP and DRP planning, insurance decision, and also information security awareness. Benefits of a risk analysis are good corporate and IT governance. We can focus on effort and resources, and also input to policy development, input to BCP and DRP planning, insurance decision, and information security awareness. Also, when we do that properly, emerging and new technologies will be addressed because we're part of our whole architecture design. Also, a regular risk review process to include future technologies, and this is a cycle. From a risk analysis, my input, my users, my system administrators, security analysts, officers, auditors, consultants, also vendor security bulletins and previous audit findings. There needs to be a management buy-in. This is my team. Also, I need to use capable staff, which is a key word from internal audit, physical security, logical security, because I need that band that covers both logical and physical. Also, business champions. Those are experts in the business processes, and also business custodians. I need to create a group risk office if it's a large organization for all of these to follow into. We'll have internal audit, physical, logical security, and business risk flowing into group risk office. And then also from an automated risk analysis tools, we'll use these to minimize our effort. We can reuse the data on subsequent analysis, and also complex calculations and risk models are done within an acceptable time window. Now, how do we do that? We're going to identify our assets, vulnerabilities to those assets, the inherent risk or the risk that comes with that asset. We're going to document our current controls, then identify our resultant or residual risk, document our findings, and management review and sign off. And as you can see from the ISMS system in ISO 27000, this is quite a nice relationship to it. There's two types of risk analysis we can do. We can do quantitative risk analysis, and I always say to the guys, think about counting in something and also where money is involved. Qualitative risk analysis is the quality, whereby each of these two provide unique views. Normally, both are used in combination with the best fit in the organization. When we do our quantitative risk analysis, we need to understand that we have to have monetary value for all elements of the asset register, and it has to be quantified. This means if you look at it, it's difficult to quantify or define the complete asset register, so this will be complex and difficult to achieve. My time and resources requirement is very high. Now, how do we do this? A quantitative step, we have to determine potential losses, we have to conduct a threat analysis, and then determine the annual loss expectancy, also known as the ALE or annualized loss expectancy. Now, let's look at it first and foremost. We need to define an asset value. This is the cost during a life cycle. And the life cycle is from the start to the finish. So this is from procurement, development, the maintenance, and then also the decommission. We need to understand there's a value to the owner, the custodian, which may be different, the user or competition. There is a liability for exposure. So if it's personal data, I may be liable if this comes out using any unauthorized means. And there's also a cost justification in the business or black market. Step one, we have to estimate a single loss expectancy. This is an SLE. Now, SLE is the value of the assets times the probability factor. This is percentage-wise. Also, the probability is also known as the exposure factor. The exposure factor is the percentage of asset loss when the threat is successful, and also losses to consider includes things like, but not limited to, theft, destruction, interference with use, and public image. Then we do a threat analysis. We need to look at the annual rate of occurrence, or the ARO. This is the number of occurrences that can be expected per year. For example, once every 5 years is 0.2 or 20%. 10 times a year is times 10 or 1,000%. Then we need to determine the annualized loss expectancy, the ALE. Now, the ALE is the SLE times the ARO, the single loss expectancy times the annualized rate of occurrence. The objective is to justify compensating controls. This is where we decide what is the amount of money we can spend to address that risk. Now, on the other side of the coin, qualitative risk analysis is scenario-based. It does not assign absolute values to risk components, and a pure qualitative risk analysis is possible. It's normally shorter and less resource intensive. Now, the critical success factors can be rank risk based on the impact and sensitivity, and it's also a call of judgment by topic experts. We have information security experts, information security and information technology managers and the staff, business asset owners and users, and also senior management. Other risk analysis methods include failure modes and effect analysis. There we looked at effects of failure at 3 levels. Immediate, currently where we are sitting, say for example it is a business being run in the office. Intermediate, the whole, say the network, and probably system-wide, how does my system being failure affect the system of the organization. The FMEA is a design tool used to systematically analyze postulated component failures and identify the resultant effects on system operations. Then also another one we can use is fault tree analysis, something like spanning tree analysis. We can have a tree with branches and we'll prune the non-threats and we'll set and be left over with the high threats. Now, a couple of risk mitigation options include things like risk acceptance. Risk acceptance does not reduce any effects, however, it is still considered a strategy. This strategy is a common option when the cost of other risk management options, such as the avoidance or limitation, may outweigh the cost of the risk itself. We can have a risk reduction or limitation. The risk limitation is the most common risk management strategy used by businesses. This strategy limits a company's exposure by taking some action. Also, risk transference is the involvement of handling risk off to a willing third party, such as insurance. Risk avoidance is the opposite of risk acceptance. However, it is the action that avoids any exposure to the risk whatsoever. Risk avoidance is usually the most expensive of all risk mitigation options. Then the next step from a risk management point of view, we need to look at staff. We need to look at hiring of staff, background checks. There should be a police clearance and credit checks. Also a reference check. Who's responsible? Is it your HR, or do you get the staff member from a personnel agency, or otherwise known as a headhunter? You must make sure that the user signs an acceptable use policy and also a declaration of secrecy. When we terminate a user, we have to look at human resources, HR, to make sure that everything is locked down. Exit procedure will include things like revoked access to resources. We need to debrief a staff to make sure why is he leaving, is there any other issues we need to look at it. Also, when we look at termination, it is specific based on local laws. Now, also think globally in the sense of some states in America has what they call an at-will agreement with a staff member, which means that you can terminate a employment with immediate effect without any recourse. And other states, well, specifically South Africa and Germany, where you cannot easily get rid of staff. You have to go through the process of mediation and arbitration, and also education and training. Now, there's an external reaction with customers and contractors, and normally a separate payment register is created for contractors, which adds complexity to identity and access management. We need to also consider vendors and suppliers from a risk management point of view, and also temporary staff. Temporary staff normally does not sign the same contracts and policies as permanent staff. We find that in the marketplace, and you need to consider that. Personnel best practices include things like job descriptions is important, performance key indicators, ensuring that we can manage and monitor staff, roles and responsibilities, ensuring separation of duties to ensure that no fraud takes place or the risk of fraud is lower, job rotations to make sure also that there's a fraud management function, but also it includes the objective of business continuity. Compulsory leave, many organizations looks at 10 days consecutive per year to ensure that no fraud can take place. Again, the fraud management tool. However, if you do that, you need to consider to activate the HR system to enable the user or disable the user to get on site, and also remote access needs to be revoked at that point in time. Then security training awareness is the objective to increase in knowledge, which has a positive impact on deliverables and morale. We have security awareness, which is not training. It is a continuous process to change user behavior. On-the-job training is most effective. We can have professional education. However, we need to ensure that when we do security awareness and training, with education, assessment, and the evaluation processes are taking place to make sure that we have value add. Then also, when we look at awareness, we need to consider that different levels require different targeting of the awareness. Executive and line management, support staff, operation, and also temporary staff. Contractors and consultants has to go through the education awareness. And what we find is that normal staff is totally different from a awareness point of view, where executive management wants to the point, and staff would rather prefer the interactive and entertaining aspects. Then finally, the security function. If we dig deeper within this system, we can look at management role and responsibilities. We can look at management reporting and structure within a risk management and a security function. We can look at type of controls. We've seen that in the access control module, from example, physical, logical, and administrative controls. Information classification, we've seen it is very important, and also hopefully you have a security policy defining that. Risk analysis is a management of risk. We've seen also that we have two types of risk management approaches, and then the security principles, or the triad. Now, when we look at security management, what does it cover? In an organization, who's responsible, where do they report to, and who is their line management? Is there a result for non-performance and non-compliance, and the educational framework and impact? This is part of security management's deliverables. And security management should be a top-down approach, defense in depth from all the layers, if we look at that. So from the outside, in a sense of physical security, when you look at domain 10 from a physical security point of view, logical security point of view, and then also from a management point of view. One of the formal methodologies I like to usually say to the guys, just look at it, is TOGAF, which defines the open group, and it's a relation between theory and in the work environment. Then finally, security administration and supportive controls could be administrative controls, also known as procedural controls, technical controls such as logical controls, we've seen that, physical controls, and then line management is a critical success factor in relation to that enforcement. When we look at IT security requirements, it is a critical node of the security program. We will have this whole risk analysis and input to a security architecture. It defines the security behavior of the control, such as the supporting documentation for policies, such as procedures and standards. It's selected based on a risk assessment that we've seen there, and two types of requirements. We've got a functional requirement, meaning there's a production environment, and there's also an assurance requirement, meaning that the auditing has taken place and made sure that we are doing as required. When we look at operational business requirement, there are a mission statement. We've seen that right in the beginning. There's key control documentation such as legal requirement. There's a certification and accreditation requirement, and we'll see that in the 4 more models. There's a security requirements which are dissimilar from organization to organization. It has to be cost effective and efficient. There's 3 levels of security planning. There's strategic, where are we going to? There's tactical, and that is basically the decisions that we make from a point of view of making sure that things are protected and things are secured adequately. And operationals are day-to-day processes. And there is definitely an interdependency between those plans. And that concludes risk management.